The following is an interview with Dr. Shirley Moody Turner of Penn State University, conducted by Lindsay Stewart at the Penn State University as part of the 2012 National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute on Contemporary African American Literature.
So thank you for being with us, Dr. Shirley Moody Turner. How would you describe your approach to teaching African American literature as a tradition?
Okay. Well, I think what has been one of the most important things for me in teaching African American literature has been not to approach it as this kind of linear evolution. So, sometimes people get caught in this framework and this paradigm of thinking about African American literature as a tradition that starts off in these kind of rudimentary ways and then develops into kind of more sophisticated forms until you arrive at this kind of current moment in which it's, reached its highest levels. And I really try to avoid that kind of framework, and instead to look at each text and each period as, what is this work doing in this particular cultural moment? How is it in conversation with other texts? How is it in conversation with the different social, historical, political moment? And so to really try to take the text on the terms that were given, as opposed to reading it as this development. And I also, actually, John Ernest, I'm going to paraphrase him, he said that the literary gods and goddesses yield their answers in relation to the questions that we ask. And so, I try to think about what kinds of questions am I bringing to these texts, what kinds of critical frameworks am I going to use to interpret these texts. And so I think that it's really interesting if you think, you can kind of use these most contemporary frameworks to look at contemporary literature and come up with these really wonderful explorations of how texts are working, but you can use those frameworks to read works earlier in the tradition as well. And so I try to kind of be very cognizant of the complexity of different texts throughout the tradition.
Has this always been your approach, or has it changed?
I think it's always been my approach. Because I work in the late 19th century, and actually because I started in the 1930s and 40s with Zora Neale Hurston. That was kind of my entry into African American literature. I started there, and I saw this really complex work that Hurston was doing with folklore, and I just kept going back, and saying, well, where is this coming from? Where is this coming from? And so as I was going back, it was still very complicated to me. It was like there was this really complex genealogy that needed to be recovered.
So what was your response to Ken Warren's proclamation that African American literature ended with the demise of legalized segregation?
I think that Ken Warren makes a good point in identifying the significance of Jim Crow segregation and how this was such an important, obviously historical moment, and that writers had to respond to this. I think that one of the challenges is when you start to see anything as this kind of holy grail of like, this is it now, this is the thing that defines African American literature. And we've seen this kind of gesture take place again and again, where folks will say, well, this is it, this is the defining feature, this is the defining feature. And I think the problem with that is that, one, there have always been works that have not engaged with the African American experience in the ways that Warren is detailing. So when Warren talks about, these works had to respond to Jim Crow segregation, there have always been what Claudia Tate calls anomalous texts. There have always been these kinds of anomalous texts that don't take up those issues, that deal with white life novels, and so then the problem is those texts get excluded. You know, it's like, well, they don't really fit, so we don't really talk about them. And I think that's one of the real problems. And I think that there have also always been these kinds of pronouncements about this is what African American literature is supposed to do. You know, and there have always been artists and writers who have pushed back against that. You know, and said, well, that's great. You know, Du Bois outlined what African American literature was supposed to do. And then Harlem Renaissance writers like Langston Hughes and others kind of pushed back against that and said, no, we're going to, you know, we want to do something slightly different. And so I think it's one of those interesting attempts to try to define some feature that says this is African American literature. And I think it's just always been kind of messier and more complex than that.
So what new trend or issue in African American literature has caught your interest over the past 2 decades?
I think one of the really interesting things with African American literature, contemporary African American literature, is the ways in which authors are willing to engage African American identity and questions of race, but in these really new and complex ways. And so what I'm really excited about is that we have a lot of contemporary authors who are not really embracing this kind of post-racial idea, but are saying, no, this is still racialized and still kind of accepting and exploring what it means to be an African-American writer and what it means to have an African-American identity and what does that mean, but doing it and really trying to expand that. You know, and to say, I'm not going to jettison that idea altogether. I think that idea is still important, but I think we need to complicate the ways that we think about that. And our own Evie Shockley is, you know, has written about this in her new book, Renegade Poetics, and you know, really got me thinking about that. And I think it's really important to see writers doing that, to see them complicating the ways that race is operating. I also think that there's some really interesting things that I'd mentioned in one of the discussions earlier that are going on in terms of how authors are crossing lines between different forms and different media. Sharon Bridgeforth, for example, who her recent book, Love Conjure Blues, is a performance novel that is also, you know, exists in different forms, where she has YouTube clips of different performances, where she's got installations, where there's all of these different forms in which you can kind of engage and interact with this novel, and I think that's really exciting too. So I think seeing what people are able to do in terms of playing with form and media is really one of the interesting trends.
So you've been talking about contemporary literature and the new things that's going on in African American lit. How important is it to you that we teach contemporary literature, urban, hip-hop, fiction, etc.?
I think it's really important. I think that teaching some of the more popular forms of contemporary African American literature is really important. I think on the one hand, it has us engaging with our students in a different way. Not that our students aren't reading all different kinds of contemporary fiction, or not reading all different kinds of contemporary fiction, but you know, the idea is that these more popular forms are being read by a wider audience, and so it's well, what is being read, and how can we participate in that conversation? How can we provide our students with critical frameworks through which to think critically and consciously about this literature that they're engaging? And at the same time, it asks us, you know, are we willing to learn from our students? You know, are we willing to hear what do they think about this? Why are they reading this? What is this doing for them? What kinds of meanings are they making out of these texts? And so I think it really pushes us to engage in conversation with our students about what it is that they're reading. I think these popular texts do important cultural work. You know, what is it that makes them popular? What kinds of representations are being produced and consumed? And I don't think those are conversations that we as academics should be left out of. You know, I think it's really important that we participate in those conversations. I also think that it continues to diversify the tradition, which I'm very, I'm always trying to diversify and expand the tradition. I mean, I think that traditions are meant to be organic and are meant to respond to, current circumstances and different contexts. So I think that those kinds of texts really keep the tradition alive and keep it vital.
Thank you. So transitioning into talking about the Institute, how did you prepare for your sessions?
I thought about, I really thought about, what am I working on right now that is interesting, that could possibly lend some kind of critical framework that would be useful. For me, I'm always thinking about folklore and trying to expand the ways I think about folklore and discourses of folklore and practices of folklore. So I wanted to be able to bring that to a group of really, really bright and engaged scholars and, offer it up as one model, but then also to get them to kind of help me think through, how can I revise this? How can I expand this? How can I think about this differently? So, I thought about what I was working on and what was interesting for me and what was kind of pushing and challenging my thinking and how I could get a room full of scholars to, work with me, in engaging those ideas.
Well, thank you, Dr. Moody Turner, for your replies and time.
Well, thank you for your wonderful questions.